Hello, this is Vulturefire, and today's video is a field guide to the Battered Ramparts. So, a long time ago, I did a video that covered the monsters and what they dropped in each of the areas. With the release of a new Area 1, I figured I would go and do a video for that, for the new area, the monsters in it, and the cards they drop. And this time, instead of just covering the cards, I'm also planning to talk a little bit about what the monsters do, so you have a bit of preparation for fighting them. The other note here is I'm recording this as of Aether Storm Part 2, which is version 6141. If you are watching this at a point in the future, for example, if it is later than around, say, June or July 2022, it is likely that there have been one or more of these cards will have changed. It's possible that these monsters may have changed. So everything you hear here, if it contradicts your current game experience, be aware that I am speaking to you from the past, and this is a game where things change. So with all that out of the way, let's get started. We're going to start with normal enemies. I'm just going to run through all the normal enemies, talk about those, then talk about the elites, then talk about the mid-bosses, then talk about the end bosses. Simple enough. So let's start by talking about the Barbed Lizard. We're going to go in alphabetical order. The Barbed Lizard is a large enemy. It takes up like 3 spots on the map, but it's not terribly dangerous. Has a decent amount of health. It starts with some shield. It can gain reflect, but overall there's not much to say about it. It only shows up pre-mid boss and only on its own. It won't show up with other enemies, and so it's relatively infrequent that you'll actually encounter it in a run, or it's often that if it shows up, there'll only be like 1 on the map, and so this is an enemy that you won't fight that often, and it isn't terribly memorable when you do fight it, but you know, starting off with an easy one. So the cards that it drops, one of them is called Grow Spikes. It is 1 cost skill, gain reflect 3 and vengeance 3, and then draw 1. So this is a cheap card that cycles itself and then gives you some reflect and some vengeance. It is one of the only cards in the game right now that lets you actually stack non-temporary reflect, so it's notable for that reason. If you're playing something like Goad Paladin, you probably want to try to pick this up because you just don't have other options really for this card slot. Used to there was Thorn Whip in the Mushroom Forest, but Thorn Whip now only gives temporary reflect, which is unfortunate. If you aren't playing a Goad type deck, this is pretty mediocre. It's not too expensive for what it does, so it's not a huge downside to have this, but it also won't do that much for the average deck. It does give you that Vengeance 3, so that's 24% damage for this turn, and it does replace itself, so that's something. So if you have a bit of extra mana in your relatively aggressive deck, you may get some value out of that. But also a lot of the aggressive decks right now tend to be multi-hit decks that are using largely cheaper cards that are hitting for small base damage numbers, and you're getting most of your damage out of powerful stacking. And powerful is applied after percentage-based buffs. So for example, if you have like something that's doing 2x4 and then you have 8 temporary powerful, then you'll be doing 10 damage per hit, but adding that plus 24% will only apply to the base 2, which means that it won't actually increase your damage at all without help. So Grow Spikes, overall, not going to be that useful for a lot of aggressive decks, pretty okay in a lot of defensive decks. That's what it is. Scaled Defenses is 4 mana, gain plated 4 this turn, and 12 shield, discard 1. The important note here is that you do not have to discard in order to get the shield and the plated. This means if this is the last card you play in the turn and you don't have anything to discard, you're still fine. It doesn't. You'll still get the plated. You'll still get the shield. The other note here is being a defensive card, you often are fine to play this later in a turn, which is very valuable. One of the problems that you can hit with like mana cards that require you to discard, so like Siphon card, which is gain 3 mana, discard 1, is that you'll find yourself in a position where you are playing it and then you need to play it early in a turn and then make decisions about what you're not going to need. Whereas with Scaled Defenses, because it is a defensive card, you can often hold off on playing it until later in a turn. So when you play it, you will know what you can afford to discard because it's going to be, whatever you have left when you're playing it is probably not something you care about playing this turn. All that out of the way, it is a solid defensive option. It's a decent amount of shield. It's a pretty good amount of plated. If you have discard synergies, that's pretty good. It does cost 4 mana, and 4 is a pretty high number on this patch as far as mana goes. So not every deck is going to be in the market for this. But if you are soft to fights like Shadowbone Hunters in Area 3 or Drakes in Area 2, this could come in handy for that. Because I like this a lot more than I like the Hardened Scales in Area, or Hardened Shell in Area 1, or sorry, Mushroom Forest, which is a card that gives you Plated this turn and Reflected this turn. Because I tended to find that on my defense card, I want the 12 shield more than I'm going to want the relatively small amount of damage I would get out of the Reflect this turn. So yeah, I think Sail Defenses is a fine card. Barbed Lizards, like I said, pretty rare, pretty hard to fight, but the advantage of them being alone is if you fight them, you will be offered one of these two cards, and that's pretty nice. I don't think that Scale Defenses is a super high tier card, but it's fine. Both these are fine. So, you know. Moving on, Bintahs. Bintahs are jerks. They are small, but they usually come in groups. They can apply bleed, and they can gain frenzy. They changed a little bit from beta. In beta, they would always do like 3x2 and apply bleed 1, which meant that if you were fighting multiple of them and you weren't an aggressive deck, you would find yourself in this awful position of just always being bleeding every single turn after turn 1, and that was just kind of miserable. So now they don't do that. They will often apply bleed, but they won't always apply bleed. And they are okay. They're usually not too dangerous, but you can find yourself taking some damage from them just if you don't have much shield and you can't kill on turn. If you're like relying on evasion and you're playing to kill on like turn 2 to 3, you can find yourself having to eat some damage from bleed, which can be annoying. Not going into their cards yet because Bintah Swarm is a similar enemy that also has the same cards. This is one of the only, this I think is the only instance right now of two different enemies that share the same cards. I'm trying to talk one day into giving us separate Bintah Swarm cards because I'd like to see more cards that summon allied Bintahs, but so far that is not a thing that has happened. So for now, Bintah Swarm has the same cards, but a Bintah Swarm can spawn more Bintahs, I think, as one of its actions. Normally just like does an X2 attack or will like buff all allies, but the main thing is for every I think 30 health it loses, it will spawn an additional Bintah if there is space for it. And that is something that you need to be prepared for when you are fighting it, that a Bintah Swarm on depth 3 represents like 2 or 3 additional Bintahs as you kill it. So be prepared for those to pop out because they can, just like regular Bintahs, apply bleed, which is very annoying. So the cards, like I said, both of them, same cards. And those cards are Infested Rites, which is gain 5 mana, summon 1 enemy Bintah. If you can't, lose 6 health. And then that upgrades just gain 7 mana, summon 1. Or Verminous Assault, which is 4 mana skill, summon 1 enemy Bintah. If you can't, gain bleed 2. And then you give any enemy bleed 4 and trigger it 4 times. I don't know why the ordering is different on those two. I don't know why Infested Rites gives you the mana before summoning and Verminous Assault summons before giving the bleed. But the important thing here is enemy Bintahs will always... So the other enemy summon that we have right now is Vengeful Shades. Vengeful Shades, of course, if you have not seen them, they attack for damage and then they get additional powerful. And the amount of powerful and the amount of damage base scales up with each area. So if you're summoning a Vengeful Shade in Area 3, it's going to be more dangerous than if you summon it in Area 1. Same is true of the Bintahs. The important note here is that unlike Vengeful Shades, Bintahs do not scale. Which is nice because it means that like if you summon a Bintah and you leave it and you have to leave it alive for a turn or 2 turns, you won't just be in an awful position. But the counterpoint to this is you will be bleeding every turn that you leave Bintahs alive, and that's really obnoxious. If you have enough cleanse, that's not too big a deal, but something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, for both of these cards, I would tend to take them only if I had a reason to be summoning enemies, which means basically if I'm playing Shrew, then Infested Rites in particular is very good. If I'm playing Goad Paladin, they can be good, although the bleed can be annoying for Goad Paladin to deal with, because Goad Paladin will actually want to be getting hit, whereas Shrew will just be killing them for value, to get value out of the level 4 passive. But so Infested Rites, very good on Shrew, okay on Paladin, otherwise usually pretty bad. It's okay probably on Salon, where you have like Scattered mod to do big AoE damage, but generally speaking, I would avoid this card if I'm not playing Shrew or Paladin. Verminous Assault is a lot harder of a sell. So with Infested Rites, like you're effectively paying 0 mana that is immune to fatigue to summon a Bintah. That's the main thing you're doing. You're also getting 5 mana, which is great, but that's not really why you're playing the card. Verminous Assault, though, has the problem where it costs you 4 mana to play, and that means that if the only thing you care about is summoning an enemy Bintah, it is substantially weaker. It does also technically do like 16 damage, or it'll do 20 damage, because it'll apply 4 bleed, it'll trigger it 4 times, and then because you've played a card, the bleed will trigger a 5th time just for playing the card, and that's worth 20 damage. But for 4 mana, 20 fixed damage isn't that exciting. Although obviously, if you have ways to leverage bleed on enemies, you can scale that upward. You do still have to deal with the enemy Bintah, though, and summoning enemies is a fairly expensive proposition to deal with most of the time. You are having to commit resources into it, and unless you're Shrew, you're not getting anything out of getting that kill, which is unfortunate. So, you're looking at playing, so you play Verminous Assault, you give bleed 4, and now you have to do, like, you've done about 20 damage, but you've summoned something that has about 20 health. I don't remember exactly how much health Bintahs have, but point being, you're like more or less break even on just the amount of health that you have to deal with now, but now you also have an enemy that's going to be applying bleed to you that you have to kill. And yeah, I'm just not a huge fan. I think that cheaper cards are more valuable in the current patch, and I think that 4 mana is a lot to ask from a lot of decks. And I find that, especially the bleed deck in particular, is not super happy to be playing a card that costs 4 mana and that doesn't even like draw you potentially into more mana. So yeah, I don't think I'm a huge fan of Verminous Assault. Moving on, Canum. Canum is a giant desert worm thing. It has permanent predator, and it can apply leech, poison, frail, and vulnerable. I believe those are the 4 debuffs it can apply. I believe that when it does the triple down arrow thing on depth 3, that is leech, poison, and frail, and then on the subsequent turn it will, or probably actually leech, poison, vulnerable, and then it'll hit you and apply frail. But so what this means is that predator does actually represent a meaningful improvement to its damage that it'll be dealing to you if you don't take care of it. It may also apply weak. I don't remember what all this applies. I just know it applies a lot of debuffs to you. I'm pretty sure it does not apply bleed. There are a lot of things in the Battered Ramparts that can apply bleed, but the Canum is not one of them. And so it has 2 cards. Blighted Bite, which is 3 mana for deal 3 damage to the first enemy. Give it Poison 2, Bleed 2, and Leech 2. I don't think this card is good. I think this card is pretty bad. 3 damage is just an insignificant amount of damage. Bleed 2 is an insignificant amount Poison 2 is an insignificant amount of poison. And Leech 2 is fine, but not super exciting. The Bleed 2 is okay, but again, like 3 mana is a decent amount for a Bleed deck. So if you don't care about the other 2 parts of it, then it's so-so. Theoretically, this is good in a Predator deck, but if you're playing a Predator deck, you probably have other sources of poison, and you may already have other sources of leech. And you're probably playing Barbed Gale, because that's the common way you get Predator, and that gives bleed to all enemies already. 3 mana is a lot for this effect, I think. This does nothing for you defensively, aside from sort of the very slow heal 6 from Leech, but that's very slow. And offensively, this is not a huge amount of damage. You have to be getting a lot of mileage out of that bleed, and then you have to be asking yourself, why am I not just playing Garrote or similar things that are just going to apply more bleed for cheaper? Because I think that like the bleed is the sort of most valuable part of this card, and it is not an amazing bleed source. Lurking Presence, on the other hand, is pretty good. Lurking Presence is 2 mana, and then you gain Predator 2, and you give Vulnerable 2 to all enemies. So this functionally represents 35% bonus damage to all enemies for 2 turns. That's pretty good, and that's 35% assuming that Vulnerable is the only debuff you have applied. This also has the benefit of now being, I believe, the only AoE vulnerable source that will apply 2 vulnerables to all enemies without an upgrade. On this patch, Surprise Attack got nerfed. It is now 0 mana to play, but it is only vulnerable 1 to all enemies, which means that Surprise Attack is no longer going to be anywhere near as consistent for keeping vulnerable on enemies, which makes this card way more appealing. I would generally say that if you're fighting Canum, Lurking Presence is the card that you're looking to pick up. And I think if you are an aggressive deck, Lurking Presence tends to be a pretty good card to have. So yeah. Moving on, Broken Gargoyle. So this is the first of 3 of the gargoyles. So this is the lowest tier of gargoyle. And then each tier of gargoyle dies into the next lowest tier, but since broken gargoyles are the weakest ones, when they die, they're just dead. They're tied to a status type. You can tell by the color. So like this one's arcane because it's kind of pink-purple. This one's frost because it's blue. And this one's shock because it's yellow. They do small multi-attacks so they can apply status, and they can give powerful to all enemies. So technically if you leave them alive for too long, they can be a threat. But generally speaking, broken gargoyles are pretty easy to deal with. They have been nerfed several times from where they were at when Battered Ramparts first launched. So if you've been watching some of my other videos, you may have seen some really menacing broken gargoyles. Like there was a point where these ones could threaten to freeze you on turn 1 if you just didn't have tough and couldn't make them weak. You would just potentially lose a turn. And that was really, really menacing. But that's no longer the case. They are now, none of these are terribly threatening. And I don't think there's much point dwelling on what they do. Their cards, though, are pretty good. So all of the gargoyles have 2 cards. All enemies have 2 cards, but for the gargoyles, one of the cards will be something persistence, which will be something that involves discarding and then drawing strikes. And then they have a strike that will do something when drawn or discarded. So in this case, we have Undying Persistence, which is 1 mana, discard 1. If you do, draw 1 skill, draw 1 strike, and gain tough 2. This is pretty good. If you're playing a strike-based deck, if you have any discard synergy at all, this is pretty useful, which means that Shrew obviously gets value out of it. Now, this isn't an exceptional card because it will be break even on total cards. You spend Undying Persistence and the card you draw. So that's 2 cards out of your hand to gain 2 cards from your deck. But you are getting tough 2 out of the bargain, and that's not too bad. I was higher on this card when I started playing with it, but I have come down on it a bit. I now think it's just kind of fine, but not exceptional. The upgrade is discard 2 and then draw 2 skills and 2 strikes, at which point you are going down 3 cards to go up a total of 4, and that is much stronger. But it's still not the most amazing thing ever. Pitiful Strike is very good. It is gain vulnerable 1 and lose 6 shield and deal 8x2 damage to the first enemy for 0 mana. And as a bonus, if you discard it, you get to play it for free. So obviously you need to be aggressive to take advantage of this. But this is 16 damage for 0 mana. It does make you vulnerable. It does cost you some shield. But if you're playing an aggressive deck, you probably don't care. In particular, if you're playing Shrew, you probably don't have shield anyway. You may want to get rid of your shield so you can get Mind Sap or Venomous Maneuver online. And you definitely are going to have ways to discard it. Pitiful Strike, the Ramparts are amazing for Shrew. We already saw Lingering Ritual, or not Lingering Ritual, Infested Ritual. Here's Pitiful Strike. This is another incredible card, and there are even better things that we haven't gotten to yet. Broken Gargoyles are great to hit if you are Shrew because Undying Persistence is fine, and Pitiful Strike is great. The only reason you wouldn't want Pitiful Strike is because Blade Idol Plus is so incredible right now that you may not want to dilute your strikes drawn. But even then, I think that Pitiful Strike, the fact that it is such big hits can be valuable as you're getting set up because Blade Idol kind of needs you to get some powerful before it'll get rolling. Moving on. Defensive turrets. So these little guys are one of the kinds of enemies in the Ramparts that will never show up as the only thing in a fight. They usually will show up behind a defensive wall, which we'll talk about in a moment. They'll sometimes show up with other enemies as well, especially post-mid-boss, but it means that their cards are going to be harder to get. As for what they actually do, they have a permanent rank of Shock Rune. They'll start by doing a multi-hit and apply Shock, and then they will follow up with a fairly big attack. This is actually an enemy that can pose a real threat to you, unlike the Broken Gargoyles that we just got done talking about. I think that defensive turrets are an enemy that really can potentially hurt you if you aren't ready for them, especially since if you are only able to hit the first enemy, since they do show up behind defensive walls. So the cards they drop. Gatling Focus, gain 2 mana, deal 1x3 damage to the first enemy if this was played after a strike. This is pretty good. Obviously, you know if you want it. If you're playing strikes, it's good. In particular, it is very good for obviously decks that are playing to stack powerful. I haven't actually gotten to do much with Gatling Focus because it is a relatively rare drop. Just because, like I said, these guys almost always show up alongside. In fact, they always show up alongside at least one other type of enemy, sometimes more than one, which means that you will have like a 1 in 4 or a 1 in 6 chance of getting a Gatling Focus. Gatling Focus isn't that good, I think, if you aren't able to get powerful. If this is just doing the straight 1x3 damage, I don't tend to find it that useful. But if you're a strike deck, there's a very good chance that you are able to get more value out of it than just 1x3 damage. So with that in mind, it's pretty good. I like it. I can't say the same for Voltaic Combustion. Voltaic Combustion is 2 mana, you get Powerful 1 and Shock Rune 2, and you discard 1. Now, you do get the Powerful and the Shock Rune even if you don't discard, but because of the nature of Powerful and Shock Rune, both being things that want you to play aggressive cards after them, if you don't have anything to discard to Voltaic Combustion, you probably aren't getting much value out of that anyway. So the fact that you don't technically have to discard is largely irrelevant. I think this is pretty bad. I think that Power Surge is going to be better than most of the time. It is Powerful 1. Theoretically, you could play Voltaic Combustion a bunch of times to stack a bunch of Powerful, but Powerful 1 is just not much. As a scaling method goes, you need more than that. And if you're an aggressive deck, if you're playing like a Shrew aggressive deck, you're probably not cycling your deck more than 2 times anyway, which means that, or if you're playing any aggressive deck, like it doesn't matter, I guess, which character it is. Like you could be Paladin, you could be Shrew, you could be Inna, you could be Merle, you could be anybody. If you are playing aggressive, you're probably clearing your deck fast enough. You're probably killing fast enough that you aren't seeing cards in your deck more than 1 or 2 times, which means that you're not going to be using this like long term as a scaling engine. And so this is just going to be disappointing across the board. Like I think if this were 2 mana, gain Powerful 1 and Shock Rune 2, and you didn't have to discard, it would be marginal in most decks. And this is worse than that by a noticeable margin. The sort of decks that would want to have this would be much, much happier with just having another Power Surge, Power Burst, which is the 0 mana generic common. It just gives you Powerful 2 this turn. That's going to be much better for you than Voltaic Combustion. The upgrade is, honestly, I would say this upgrade here is incredibly bad. You get Powerful 2 and Shock Rune. So you get 1 more Powerful, but you have to discard 1 more card, which means that, again, that makes this harder to play. It is all around pretty abysmal. I would say that Voltaic Combustion Plus is a miserably unplayable card. Possibly the worst monster card in the area. I would say Voltaic Combustion is maybe the worst monster card in the area, just because I don't think I can imagine any scenario where I would take it and be happy. I think Blighted Bite, the Canum card that applies Poison, Leech, Bleed, is close, but I can at least see scenarios where you might take that, especially like a Shrew deck maybe, where you're applying all those debuffs and you care. I can't imagine a scenario where Voltaic Combustion is the card you're looking for. Moving on. Defensive Wall. So Defensive Wall alternates between building up shield and attacking. Once it attacks, it loses a lot of the shield, but it gains a lot of shield on those first turns. I think it gains like 50 shield after turn 1 and 2. Like I said, it sheds most of it after it attacks, but if you can't kill this turn 1, you are not going to be able to get through it turn 2. Probably, most of the time. And this can be a problem because it, as the name suggests, being a wall, shows up in front of other enemies. If you're a strike-based deck, you need this dead turn 1. It doesn't matter if you have to overkill it. It is worth devoting extra resources to it to kill it now, rather than waiting and giving it a chance to set up all of its shield. Other than that, there's not much to say about it. It's kind of what you would expect from looking at it. Its card drops are both okay. First one is Shield Wall, which is 6 mana for gain 20 shield and sturdy 8. This may not look too exciting, but it is sturdy 8 on a monster card. And I think this may be, if not the only monster card that gives sturdy, it's at least one of the only monster cards that can give you sturdy. And 20 shield is a very respectable amount of shield. So if you're playing a more defensive deck, this can be quite valuable as just a one-stop shop for, I want all the shield right now, give it to me. The upgrade is less exciting. It's just 24 shield and sturdy 10, which is not that much better than 20 shield and sturdy 8. But Shield Wall is a card that you will sometimes pick up and be happy with. Worth noting, these cards do have the same caveat that the defensive turret cards do, where you will almost always be at best looking at a 1 in 4 chance of getting them. And these will often show up specifically with defensive turrets, which means that you have a chance of just rolling Voltaic Combustion, which is just incredibly bad, and then you're not happy at all. But Shield Wall is pretty good. Kinetic Transfer is also potentially very good. This is 3 mana, lose 6 shield. If you do, deal 30 damage to the first enemy. It's a strike. This is very similar, of course, to Mighty Punch in the Forest from Dwheels. The big difference is, with Kinetic Transfer, you must have the shield to lose. If you play Kinetic Transfer and you don't have at least 6 shield, it will do nothing. But if you can consistently have shield, this can be a way for you to close out fights relatively quickly. So, something to keep in mind. A card to consider picking up if you are playing a defensive deck. Moving on, Scyther Beetles. So these can apply bleed, they can gain temporary evasion. They tend to show up with Bintahs or Canum, although I think there was at least one fight there's just 2 Scyther Beetles. Not a whole ton to say about them besides that. Relatively low base damage, but the bleed can be very, very annoying, especially if they show up with Bintahs and you've got like 3-4 bleed at the start of your turn. You can obviously take a lot of damage pretty quick that way. Or if they set up temporary evasion when you have a single strike attack, and it's like your turn, you finally land up your singularity, and they have evasion. But yeah, not much to say about them aside from that. Their cards, first one is Keen Edged Strike. 2 mana, deal 12 damage to the first enemy if it has no shield, and give it bleed 2. So the first note here is the bleed 2 will always be applied regardless of whether or not the enemy has shield. The second note is there are a lot of enemies now that start with shield, especially in the Ramparts. Keen Edge Strike is a card that I have been disappointed with the times that I have taken it, especially because, like I said, you'll start a Ramparts fight, the front enemy is a Warbot Outrider, or it's the first front enemy is a... I don't think Scyther Beetle starts with the shield, but Defensive Walls will, or the front enemy is some of the other elites that we're going to get to, and just there's shield right off, or you're fighting Warbot Annihilator, and that starts with shield, or you're fighting the Gargoyles, and they start with shield, or you're fighting Robotic Mass, and it starts with shield, or you're fighting Infested Goliath, and that starts with shield. There are just so many fights in the Ramparts where this will just be 2 mana, give it the first enemy bleed 2, and that is disappointing almost always. Keen Edge Strike is a card that it theoretically has potential, but I'm not a fan. I think it has... Well, if you can get out of Area 1, in Area 2 and Area 3, this will miss a lot less often. But I think it misses... I don't think it has enough value later. You know, it's a single hit for an okay but not exceptional amount of damage. And then it just applies bleed 2, but there's better ways to get bleed if that's all you care about. But yeah, so it's okay in Areas 2 and 3, but in Area 1, it is off... in the Battered Ramparts, it's going to be offline far too often. And since this will be, a common... this will be pick up for one of your first fights, having it be bad throughout the rest of Area 1 is a pretty bad deal for a card that's not going to start just doing amazing work once you get out of Area 1. If this was a case where like this card is, it's bad here, but you get it to Area 2 and 3 and it's just gonna shine. But that's not really what this is. Because like even once you get to Area 2, this is going to be bad against, if you decide to fight Treants, this will be bad against Ruby Dragon. This will be bad against Drakes, because the Drakes will just evade the one hit. Yeah. Sharpen Weapons. 1 mana skill, increase the damage of all your strikes in your hand by 2, draw 1. This is pretty good in strike-based decks for obvious reasons. It's not quite as good. It's arguable whether this is as good as Power Burst, because it only applies to the strikes in your hand. But if you do happen to draw to not be winning in one turn, then that boost will carry over between turns, and it does draw a card to replace itself, which is valuable. Overall, I think this card has pretty good upside in aggressive decks, especially if you're playing a lot of multi-hits, because, of course, if you play this with Blade Idol, with like Blade Idol Plus, it will do +2 damage to all 4 hits of Blade Idol Plus, and then like if you discard that Blade Idol and then you redraw it, you could potentially be getting a total of, when you redraw it, you'll get that 2 damage will still be on it, so you're getting like a total of 16 damage just from discarding and redrawing the same thing. The same Blade Idol. It is worth noting that this increases the damage of all strikes in your hand before it discards, which means that if it draws a strike, it will not buff the strike that it draws. It upgrades to be increased damage of all strikes in your hand by 3 and be 0 cost instead of 1 cost, which is a pretty good upgrade. So this is another one of those enemies where it's like one of these cards is pretty bad, but the other one is pretty good. Moving on, I believe this is the last of the non-elite enemies. This is a Warbot Outrider. Almost all of its actions, I believe, will hit one time for relatively low damage, Then it'll either gain shield or evasion, or it'll give powerful to all enemies. It will pretty consistently attack, but it will also pretty consistently attack for like not much damage. I think their base hit is like 7 to 9, somewhere in there. So not really a huge threat. Its cards are fine. Defensive Strike is 2 mana for deal 5x2 damage to the first enemy, gain 10 shield on a critical hit. It will give you that 10 shield if either of the hits is critical. If you do have critical or you are able to get hidden, then there's a 75%. If you have a 50% crit chance, which is the enemy is ambushed or you're hidden or you have critical, but that's it. You don't have multiple of those. Then there's a 75% chance that this will give you shield, which isn't bad. Like if this is 5x2 damage and 10 shield for 2 mana, that's a pretty good deal. You do have to be a deck that actually cares about getting shield, which means you're not winning so quickly that that's irrelevant. The damage is okay, but not amazing. 5x2 is less than what Slash does now. Slash is now 4x3 for 2. But Defensive Strike is fine. It's kind of peak. I'm taking this card because I don't have a better option, and I'm planning to cut this later. Pack Strike, though, is interesting because it is gain Pack Tactics 1. Pack Tactics being a buff that says you do 1 extra damage for each ally you have. So that doesn't count you. So if you don't have any summons, then this will do nothing. But if you have 2 summons, the Pack Tactics 1 will give you +2 damage. And you'll deal 3x3 damage to the first enemy. The important thing here is the upgrade gives you Pack Tactics 2. And that makes it easier to stack. And stacking Pack Tactics is relevant because if you have 2 Pack Tactics, then you get +2 damage for each ally. So you multiply your amount of Pack Tactics by the number of allies to get your damage bonus. You can see how this could get silly quickly. If you have 2 allies even, and you have 4 Pack Tactics, you now have +8 damage on each of your hits, which is equivalent to like having 8 extra powerful. And that's very good. It won't apply to status, it only applies to damage. But especially since this will also do damage, this is a pretty good card in combination with summons. If you're playing like Spirit Swarm, this can be very good to go with Spirit Swarm. Or if you have Calling Caller, or if you have managed to get the Warbot Outrider summon item, which is a trinket that drops from one of the events in this area, then you can do some pretty crazy things. I don't think Pack Strike is one of those cards that I would only take if you have summons and you can afford to commit an upgrade to it. And you also, ideally, this isn't your only damaging card. But you can sort of cobble together a quick play run off of this if you're fighting Swarm Manipulator. Because you get the Swarm Manipulator summon, you use Pack Strike, you look for like the Gargoyle Draw Strike cards, and you just kind of loop Pack Strike as like this weird increasing stab type strategy. And that can actually be pretty effective. So something to consider. So I think that's it for our normal enemies. So moving on to the elite enemies. A reminder, if you are new to this, if you aren't really familiar with the game, if there are normal enemies in an elite fight, it doesn't matter. The fight will still drop only the elite cards. So it can drop cards from any of the monsters in the fight, but only the monsters that are at the highest tier. So if the fight is all normal enemies, then it's any of the normal enemy cards. If there are elite enemies, then any of the elite enemy cards. If there are bosses, then only the boss enemy cards. So, starting with alphabetically, the first one is the AI core. The AI core, it mostly just buffs allies, and it doesn't actually have any direct damage at all. But it can apply Arcane, and I believe it has an AoE Arcane, which means it will apply Arcane to you and your allies. I believe it has permanent plated too. And it will always show up with defensive turrets or walls in front of it. So the idea here is that it's kind of a complete defense network, and you have to shut down the whole network. You have to get through the outer defenses to get to the AI core. This is one of the easier elites, I think, generally. It can be kind of frustrating to fight, but it's relatively low threat level as far as elite fights go. The cards for it, though, are also kind of so-so. The first one is Adjustable Protocols, which is 2 mana skill. Draw 2 if this is the last card in your hand. Gain 5 mana if you have no mana. Gain 12 shield if you have no shield. This card is fine. It's not the best card ever. But it is very flexible, and that has a lot of value. I find that hitting no shield is often the hardest condition to hit, especially since most of the time, if you don't have shield, you don't want shield. Or you don't care about having shield, which means that if you can hit the condition, you don't care about hitting the condition. But But draw 2, the fact that this could be either draw or mana, depending on which one you're short on, can be pretty valuable. I don't think it's as good as Adaptative Spell was on the last patch. I don't like Adaptative Spell much on the current patch. But you can technically get... It's very difficult to hit multiple modes of this, in particular getting draw and mana, which are the two most valuable modes. It's very difficult to get both of those because you have to line up. Obviously, if you are... if this needs to be the last card in your hand, you only have so much ability to control which of your other cards you play, because you have to play all of them or get them out of your hand somehow. And that can make lining up two modes difficult. But sometimes it'll just happen, and you'll get, some mana, you'll get some cards, and you'll get some mana to play them, and that's pretty good. But yeah, overall, I would say this is a pretty card. Not bad, but Systems Overload is 5 mana skill. Apply 14 shock and 14 arcane to any enemy. This is kind of like bad Ferric Rime. Ferric Rime is, I think, 3 or 4 mana now, and it applies some frost and some arcane to an enemy. Applying shock and arcane is generally weaker, and 5 mana is a lot of mana. Systems Overload is a card that I've tried to like, but I find that 5 is just too much mana for most decks to want, considering this rarely will kill an enemy, and it also won't put the enemy out of the fight. Because the big thing with Ferric Rime is Ferric Rime is kind of expensive, but if you play Ferric Rime on an enemy, that enemy is negated for the turn. And this doesn't do that. This is an aggressive card, but it doesn't do anything to keep you alive, and it's not enough damage. This is like a preparatory aggressive card. This is setting up the shock so that you can do a bunch of damage on a later turn. But yeah, I tend to find that Systems Overload is okay, but often underwhelming, and I would usually rather have a more specialized card. If I'm trying to get shock, I would rather have Overcharge, which is just going to be an AoE shock card, or Arcane Nova, which is going to be an AoE arcane card, or something cheaper for doing one of the two jobs. I don't tend to find that there are many decks that want to spend this much mana on this particular effect. And it also, part of it is some of the mana cost here is getting to that 14 number, which is useful to be more than 10 for some fights, but it also means that you are effectively overpaying if you only are getting out, if you don't have Adept or whatever, and you're just getting a single. The 14 is kind of an awkward number because it is very difficult to push that all the way up to the 22 that you would need for the second shock or arcane detonation. But it is enough more than 10 that you're really feeling that extra mana. If this was only 11 and 11, it would technically be a 3 mana card, and it would be a whole lot more interesting, because then you would still be getting your second shock or arcane if you have Adept or if the enemy is vulnerable, but now you're not paying, but then you aren't, having to spend a whole ton of mana on this commitment. Moving on, Artillery Beetle. So Artillery Beetle has a 3-turn cycle. It has gotten nerfed substantially from where it used to be at. It used to trope with nastier enemies, and it used to hit much harder. But so it spends 2 turns building up, and then it attacks and applies arcane. I would say it used to be the original version when it hit beta was 40 arcane and 40 damage, which is ludicrous. It's now I think 24 and 24 base. It also attacks first before applying the arcane, so you can theoretically evade the attack. The original version, because it applied the arcane first, would blow up all your evasion, and then it would hit you for a bunch of damage, and you would just be big sad. Anyway, it spends 2 turns building up, then it attacks and applies arcane, and then it repeats. It is an AoE attack. It is AoE arcane, so your summons will get murdered. It doesn't matter what kind of summon you have. Drakes will evade the attack and then get blown up by the detonation. Every other summon type will just get smashed and then detonated. And making the Artillery Beetle weak is not going to save them usually. It is possible to save your allies from an Artillery Beetle, but it's going to be tricky, especially in Area 1 where you haven't had time to find better gear, find good items, and find potentially multiple copies of Spirit Helmet or whatever. Anyway, if you do fight Artillery Beetle and you beat it, both of its cards are pretty good. First one is Artillery, which deals 8 damage to any enemy, which is underwhelming for 4 mana, but then you get 3 Cannon Blasts and 3 Exhaustions. You may be wondering, why do I want Exhaustions? And the answer is, 1, you don't necessarily have to get them. One of the neat tricks with this card is, if you play it with a hand that has, so let's say you play it, and after you've played it, you have 3 spaces in your hand. It creates the 3 Cannon Blasts, your hand is now full, and it can't create any exhaustions. However, Each of those exhaustions is a 1-cost card that will do nothing, but it will make your cannon blasts cheaper. And these are the cannon blasts that Salon gets every turn. They deal 8 damage to any enemy, apply 8 arcane to that enemy, and then they also get 1 mana cheaper whenever you play a non-mana, non-cannon card. So you play artillery, you play the 3 exhaustions, and now your cannons are only 3 mana each, which means that in total, to get all of it out, it is 16 mana to play out artillery and then all 3 exhaustions and all 3 cannon blasts. Whereas if you just had to play out the cannon blasts, obviously it would be 22 mana. Substantially more would be. So, yeah. If you can play artillery and still have the ability to get the cannon blasts down to free, it tends to be pretty good. Because that is, especially if you have like any powerful and you're getting detonations out of the cannon blasts, or if you have any items that up status applied by cards, this tends to be, I find, pretty good on a lot of characters. It's not super cheap to play, obviously. You do have to have a pretty robust mana engine to support it. But if you do have the mana to support it, it does usually pay for itself. And the other note here is if you can find Strong T, which is the trinket that says that exhaustion, whenever you play an exhaustion, you draw a card, then obviously this becomes substantially better because now this is gain cannon blasts and draw cards, which is an amazing package. And the upgrade is 10 damage to the enemy, 4 cannon blasts, and 4 exhaustions, which actually ends up being pretty good because, so we said that regular artillery is 16 mana for all 3 of the cannon blasts. Artillery plus, you spend 4 mana for the artillery, 4 mana for the exhaustions, and then it actually ends up being the same 16 mana to play out everything, assuming that you don't, and that's assuming you don't have any other cards in your hand that are cheap that you could use to reduce the cannon blast cost further. This is assuming you're just playing the exhaustions. It ends up being the same 16 mana to do 4 cannon blasts now, which is an extra 8 damage and 8 arcane, which is pretty good. Carapace is 3 mana skill, gain 4 shield per card in your hand. So if you draw your hand of 5 and you play this as the first card in the turn, that's worth, it doesn't count itself, so it'll be worth 16 shield. So 3 mana for 16 shield is an okay deal. And if you can draw more cards, this becomes better. It is worth noting the sturdy shield bonus will only apply once. You just gain 1 instance of shield. So sturdy and like shield gained by card bonuses will only apply once. So if you have 24 sturdy, you just get plus 4 shield from it, regardless of how many cards you have in hand. But if you have like 7 or 8 cards in hand, this pretty quickly becomes like if you have 7 other cards in hand, then this is 28 shield, which is a very respectable amount. So if you're playing a character like Inna in particular, who is very good at flooding her hand with tools, this can be a lot of shield for very cheap. So I like it a lot. If you aren't playing a defensive deck, you don't care. Or if you're playing a defensive deck that doesn't care about shield, then it's not that good. But it is worth keeping in mind if you are playing Inna. Like this, generally speaking, I would say Artillery Beetle is a great enemy to fight as Inna because both Artillery and Carapace play very well with tools. Artillery because the cannon blasts can be cost reduced very quickly by playing tools, which tend to be cheap and often will draw you more cards. And Carapace is going to go well with the full hand that you'll often have. Moving on, Bomber Unit. Talked about Barbed Lizard only shows up before the mid-boss. Bomber Unit only shows up after the mid-boss, and it always shows up with 3 bombs in front of it. The main threat here is that the bombs do damage when they explode, and their explosion damage goes up every turn, and they explode automatically from being on fire after a couple turns. The Bomber Unit itself will also apply burn to you, and I think it will trigger burn on you, and I think it just can ruin your day otherwise. But this is a fight that tends to be dangerous because if you are an aggressive deck, you have to kill the bombs and then they explode and deal damage to you, and you don't have the defense to deal with it because they just deal damage on death, and there's no way you can avoid that. Like even if you have arcane detonations to try and dispel the volatile, you'll only be able to get rid of. They start with I think 10 volatile, and you only get rid of 1 per detonation, and they only have like 15 health, so you're getting out at most 2 detonations, and you're still taking 24 damage from the 3 bombs dying. So that can be annoying. And then if you're playing a defensive deck, they do a lot of damage, and the Bomber Unit itself also hits pretty hard. This fight tends to be kind of a pain in the butt, and I don't know that it's worth it because let's talk about the cards. So Explosive Revelation is pretty good. It is actually a pretty reasonable card. It's 2 mana to draw 3, and you summon 1 enemy bomb. The enemy bombs are the same things that you have in this fight, where they will deal damage when they explode, and they will every turn increase the amount of explosion they will do, and they also start with birds. They will be taking down towards their explosion. As with many summon cards, like you have to weigh whether or not you can efficiently deal with the summon. I tend to find that this is one of the only summons that is actually good for one of the only summon cards that is actually good for purely defensive decks, because you just have to plan around being able to tank the explosion. So it's kind of like a very weak version of a much smaller version of Ruinous Gamble, which is the card that draws you a bunch of cards and then gives you Doom. If you can't summon the bomb, you just discard 2, which actually makes this a slightly worse contemplate if you can't summon. I say slightly worse. You have to draw 3, discard 2 instead, draw 3, discard 1, which is substantially worse. But it is at least that doesn't mean that it is very playable if you can't summon. Whereas some of the other summon cards, like Infested Rites, causing you to lose a bunch of life if you can't summon, can be a problem if you don't have healing. And this one is very playable even if you can't summon. So Explosive Revelation is fine. I would generally be okay. If I'm fighting Bomber Unit, that's the reason why. Volatile Powder, on the other hand, is very bad. So it is 4 mana spell, give Unstable 10 to the first ally, deal 6 damage, and give Burn 4 to any enemy. So Unstable 10 to the first ally means that if the first ally dies, it will deal 10 damage to all enemies. Hooray! That's not very exciting. If this was 4 mana, deal 10 damage to all enemies, deal 10 fixed damage to all enemies, that would be okay. But this is so much worse than that. There will be fights where your front ally just won't die. If you draw this before you get any allies, this won't do anything. If you're playing a deck that has allies but doesn't want them to die, which is most of them, then this isn't great. If you have an ally if you put on an ally and that ally dies to being summoned over, that currently doesn't do anything. The Unstable currently won't go off. At least as far as I know, I haven't actually tested. I reported that as a bug, I think, on a previous version. I don't know that I've actually tested on the current version. And then 6 damage and Burn 4 is just nothing. That is Firebolt in Area 2 is a common card that the Drakes drop, and it just does 6 damage and Burn 4 to any enemy, and it is only 2 mana, and it is not amazing. It is fine. Generally speaking, the other note here is Immolate is 2 mana for just give Burn 4 to any enemy, and that's just a generic common. And usually the Burn deck doesn't care about dealing 6 damage, because most of your damage is going to be coming from Burn, which means that you don't have that many buffs to your actual raw damage, and 6 damage is 1 burn trigger. So that's just not very exciting. This is Volatile Powder is just bad. It's expensive, it's low impact, and there are other cards that do what this does better. Damaged Gargoyle. So I mentioned that we have 3 tiers of Gargoyle. This is the middle one. Damaged Gargoyles die into Broken Gargoyles. They still have status types, still indicated by color. So Arcane, Frost, Shock. They can apply status. They can do multi-attacks. They can buff all allies. And then, like I said, on death, they turn into Broken Gargoyles. And they will keep all of their buffs when they die, but not their debuffs, which is true of Rebirth enemies in any area. So their cards, similar to the other Gargoyles, like I said, you have a Strike and a Persistence. Their Strike is deal 4x4 damage to the first enemy, corrupt 1 yourself, and you play this card when discarded. So a lot of times, you will just play this and ignore the corrupt portion, and it's fine. This is another card that you play when discarded for free, that you can also just, if you can't discard it, you just play it outright, and it does a ton of damage, and it's great, because 1 mana for 4x4 is very respectable. The corrupt 1 yourself is often something you can ignore, but you do need to be aware that it is a part of this card, because this will increase how much fatigue you have, this will increase how much shock you have, this will increase how much bleed you have, this will increase how much vulnerable you have, this will increase how much curse you have, and so on. You want to pay at least some attention when you're using this to make sure you're not going to ruin your own day with it. But generally speaking, it's relatively safe to play, and it is very effective at just outputting a lot of damage for cheap. And if you have any discard synergies, it obviously becomes substantially stronger. I mentioned this area is great for Shrew. This is another one of the reasons why. And this is, so to give you an idea of how good Gargoyles are to fight, Defective Strike is an amazing card, and you are sad to see it relative to the other Gargoyle card. Like, the fact that Defective Strike is not just the worst of the 2 cards this monster drops, but by far the worst of the 2 cards this monster drops, should tell you a lot about how good Enraged Persistence is. Enraged Persistence is a 1-mana skill that discards 1, and then if you do, you draw 2 strikes, gain Powerful 2 this turn, and gain Vengeance 3. So Power Burst is gain 2 powerful this turn. That is pretty good. This is much better than that, because the problem with Power Burst is you draw Power Burst and then you don't have any strikes to go with it sometimes, and then you can't get max value out of it. Enraged Persistence does not have this problem. You're playing Shrew, you play Enraged Persistence, you discard a Blade Idol, you draw 2 Blade Idols, you get Powerful 2 and Vengeance 3, and then you attack for like, between the Powerful and the Vengeance, you're then attacking for like 5x4 for each Blade Idol, which is, you discard 1 and you drew 2, so that's like a total of 5x12. And that's if this is the only powerful source you have. That is ludicrous. And Enraged Persistence Plus is still only 1 mana, still only discard 1, but now you're drawing 3 strikes, you're getting Powerful 3 this turn, and you're still getting the Vengeance 3. So, now you're able to get even more ridiculous nonsense for the same low price, and you're getting even more powerful. Enraged Persistence is nuts. This card is crazy. If you have not played an aggressive strike-based deck with Enraged Persistence, you should try it, and you will see what I mean. Enraged Persistence is nutty, and that's true even if you don't actually have any discard synergies and you are just caring about, like, if you're just like discarding some random card you normally wouldn't want to discard, it doesn't matter. The amount of value you get from those strikes is, for the powerful and drawing strikes, is just incredible. The upgrade's incredible, and if you can get multiple copies of this, absolutely do. They stack very, very well because now you're getting even more powerful to go with your strikes you're drawing, and that's just very good. You'll just be very happy. Moving on. I'm pretty sure Enraged Persistence is getting nerfed in the next patch somehow because card's crazy, but you're watching this soon enough after this video comes out. Enjoy while you can. Moving on. Defensive Cannon. Defensive Cannon has a permanent rank of all 3 runes, and it can do multi-attacks up to X4. So when you're fighting Defensive Cannon, you need to pay close attention to when you are going to get frozen, because it can and it will freeze you. Evasion is very useful against it. Arcane is even better. You can Arcane Detonate it, you'll be very happy, because that will let you take away its ability to freeze you, and that will help keep you alive. It will usually show up behind defensive walls and cannons, and that means that you often, if you're fighting it, you want to make sure you have some way to get at it quickly, or you want to have some way to reduce the status that you have, and you really don't want to have self-status that's applying self-frost, because it is really easy to just like accidentally forget, and you play your Frozen Hide, and then you get frozen by it, and then you die. Defensive Cannon can be brutal, but it can also be managed. The earlier versions of it were much worse. There was a point where it had an X6. It used to have like, I think over 150 health plus shield initially, and then it could do like an X6 attack, which means that you would just like get frozen, arcane detonated, and shocked on turn 1. And so that was 20 damage, and you lose your second turn. And then it would like hit you for like 40 damage while you were frozen. And then you would finally get another turn. And yeah, it just wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. Scars, though, are pretty. They're pretty good. Elemental Blast is the weaker of the two, but it's far from bad. Elemental Blast is 6 mana. You deal 6 damage to any enemy. You apply 1 fixed Frost, 1 fixed Shock, and 1 fixed Arcane to it per damage dealt. So, you base rate, you're doing 6 damage and applying 6 Frost, Shock, and Arcane, which is pretty bad. But if you can do more damage, then you can do more things. It doesn't take too much effort for this to be doing at least, 10 to 20 damage, at which point it is doing 10 to 20 of every status. But really you want the upgrade. The upgrade is 8 mana, which is a huge investment, but you now get, and it still is only doing 6 damage base, but now it is doing 2 fixed Frost, fixed Shock, and fixed Arcane to it per damage dealt, which means that every point of extra damage you can get out of it is worth 2 extra status, and that makes it a lot easier to use it to get the triple threat of Frost, Shock, and Arcane out. Elemental Blast Plus even if you don't have any other damage boosts, you can, as long as you aren't like doing less than base damage, then the first time you point it at an elite, you will get the full triple status, which will be worth 20 damage from that, because the arcane detonation will be then on a shocked and frozen enemy, and it will then, of course, lose its next turn because it's frozen. Of course, 8 mana is a hefty investment, but unlike some of the other expensive cards we've talked about so far, I would say this is one that's worth it. Not every deck is going to want this. Not even every slow deck is going to want this, but it can be a fun finisher if your deck is positioned to use it, which means you just have to have somebody to crank up that damage, which can be tricky, and you have to be able to get enough mana to pay for it. But it's a fun card. The other one is Elemental Prowess. Gain Arcane, Frost, and Shock Rune 2. You apply 3 fixed status of each type to yourself, so 3 Arcane, 3 Frost, and 3 Shock, and then you draw 1 strike. This is good. This is incredible. If you're familiar with Elemental Strike, which is a card that shows up in Area 2, this is Elemental Strike, but in some ways better. The fact that it does status yourself can be a negative in some cases, but mostly is irrelevant. And this just outright will give you runes of every type for the next turn as well, so you don't need to play, you don't need to find a way to copy it in order to keep the uptime on it. And this also doesn't require you to be running a relatively lower value strike in order to get the value. The one downside here versus Elemental Strike is if you are playing a deck that has a lot of draw strike cards, it can be useful that with Elemental Strike you can find it with like an Enraged Persistence or whatever. But I mean, if you have a multi-hit deck, you're never going to turn down triple rune. This is incredibly powerful with any deck that is able to hit a bunch of times. This goes great with cards like Defective Strike or Gatling Focus that we already talked about. And this will go great with cards from Area 2, or it'll also go great with like the Relentless Assault that we're going to talk about soon, or cards in Area 2 like 100 Bites, or trying to think what else, like Pulverize is also pretty good with it, technically. Although Pulverize is kind of expensive, but still. Elemental Prowess, pretty good. Piercing Warbot. If you are not new to the game, you are probably already familiar with Piercing Warbot. This is one of 2 enemies that can also show up in the Mushroom Forest that is from the Ramparts. It is kind of an invader in the forest in that like the Warbots clearly come from the Ramparts. If you look at the rest of the enemies in the Ramparts, you have a lot of other kinds of Warbots. And then like the Piercing Warbot and the Serrated Warbot just kind of invade the forest. It does show up usually with other Warbots. I believe it always shows up post-mid-boss. It works the same way that it does in the forest. It will gain evasion. It can apply weak to you. It can gain shield. It's kind of a defensively oriented thing. And it drops the same cards. Mana Dance is a mana card that gives you 2 mana and gives you evasion 1 this turn. That's still very good. Swift Strike, as of this patch, is gain evasion 1 this turn, deal 3x2 damage to the first enemy. That's not amazing damage, but it comes with free evasion, which is nice. So both of these are pretty good if you are playing a deck that is not planning to win on turn 1. To just have this free source of temporary evasion tends to be pretty handy. Just solid cards. They're not new. I don't think I need to spend that much long talking about them. Serrated Warbot, the other new enemy, or the other returning enemy. Like the Piercing Warbot, it tends to show up with other Warbots. It can apply bleed. It can stack offensive buffs. Like I said, same fight you're used to from the forest if you're more used to the game at this point, and you've probably seen this enemy. This is the more offensively oriented one, unlike the Piercing Warbot. So be prepared for it to potentially do a lot of damage if you leave it alone for too long. Its 2 cards are also thus very offensive. Impale is Corrupt 1 the first enemy and deal 4x2 damage to it for 0 mana. The Corrupt 1 tends to be relatively low value. This will let you get more turns of like Vulnerable, or will let you up the amount of Curse or whatever on the enemy, but that tends to be relatively unimportant. This is a 0 cost 4x2 damage, and that's fine, but not as noteworthy as it would have been like last patch. On the previous, before the big mana rebalancing, this would have been quite a bit more notable as a 0 cost thing, but on this patch it's just kind of so-so. We already talked about like Pitiful Strike, which has some downsides but does 8x2 damage for free. So Impale is fine, but rarely the card that you're looking for. Relentless Assault, though, is 2 mana for deal 3x5 damage to the first enemy, and that's a lot of hits. It upgrades to be 4x6 damage. So we've talked about a lot about like powerful stacking and such. Relentless Assault is, of course, a great way to use powerful stacking. You know, you play Enraged Persistence and you draw this, and it's doing, I think, like 6x5 because the Vengeance is worth an additional +1, and then you get the powerful 2. So at that point, it goes up to being 2 mana for, like 30 damage. You know, if you play Elemental Prowess and you draw this, then you do 10 of each status to the thing that you hit, and that's pretty good. Relentless Assault is just a really nice solid card that is kind of perfect if you are playing a multi-hit based deck. And I think that's all I have really to say about those. They're familiar cards. You're used to them by this point if you have played the game a bunch. Warbot Raidleader. Warbot Raidleader shows up with Warbot Outriders, and sometimes they'll show up with the Piercing or Serrated Warbots. This one is new to, unlike the other two, this is new. It is also a Warbot, though. It can also summon the Warbot Outriders. That are the little enemies that we talked about earlier. And it has permanent pack tactics, too, which means that it gets more damage for every additional enemy that is alive. It also has, most of its attacks are fairly weak, but it does have an attack that does a lot. It's like something X4 base, and then it applies a bunch of Arcane, and that attack can do a lot of damage, especially if it has a lot of allies. So being able to take away its allies is useful, and you obviously want to kill it before it can summon too many Outriders to make your day worse. And that's about all I have to say about what it does. Its cards are fine. So Group Focus is mana, gain 3 mana, and you gain 1 mana per ally alive. So as I mentioned with one of the other cards, with the Pack Tactics, you don't count as your own ally. So if you don't have anything summoned, this is just gain 3 mana, which is fine. Gain 3 mana with no downsides is perfectly acceptable. And then if you do have any allies, this can be, up to, if you have 3 allies summoned, which does require there to only be 1 enemy, and that enemy has to only take up 1 spot. This could give you up to 6 mana. But usually in a summoning deck, this will be somewhere between like 3 to 5 mana, and that's pretty good. 3 to 5 mana with no downside is very solid, if not amazing. So that's fine. Rampage is interesting. So it is 4 mana for deal 3x3 damage to the first enemy if you're critical. If you have critical, 3x3 if you have mighty, and 3x3 if you have powerful. So this one is a card that is kind of a little bit difficult to evaluate because it has this very, very high swing, and it has a very large swing between when it is good and when it is bad. So when you do have all of the buffs, it is 3x9 for 4 mana, which is pretty dang good, especially since that will be at least 5x9 with 50% crit chance because you have critical and mighty and powerful. On the other hand, it has the problem that if you don't have any of those buffs, it does nothing. The upgrade, by the way, bumps all those to 4x4 up from 3x3, which means that if you have all of the buffs, you are now doing, I think it'll go up to like 6x12. And so that is 72 damage. And that's 12 hits. So that's obviously a lot of value. And it could be obviously a whole lot more if you have more than one powerful. I would generally speaking, I would only take Rampage if I am always hitting at least 1, and if I am consistently hitting at least 2. So if you have the Might Rune trinket, that means you start with Mighty, or if you have Scroll of Blood, which means you start with Powerful, or if you're playing a character like Cheru that's basically always going to be able to get access to Powerful, or if you're playing Khaitan and you have Shifting Focuses to get your Mighty and your critical from, or if you have if you have any of the trinkets that give you, there is also a couple other trinkets that give you Mighty or Powerful. So there are a lot of ways to get there, but I would want to make sure that I can consistently trip it. And then if you can get all 3 of them consistently, it obviously becomes a very high value pickup that will do a lot of work for you. But 4 mana is obviously a relatively high investment for aggressive decks, but if you can turn it on, it'll pay off. Moving on, that's all the normal enemies, that's all the elites. Talk about mid bosses. Only 3 mid bosses. Although the Sliges show up as a pair. So Sliges, slugs, slimes. I have no clue how these are supposed to be pronounced. They always show up as a pair. They have permanent Envenom. They have plated while they have shield, and they have powerful while they don't. To explain a bit more how this works. When you start the fight, they will have a bunch of shield and they'll have plated 3. When you remove all their shield, they will lose all the plated they have and gain powerful 3. Then, if they gain shield later, and they do have a move that will apply shield, but also if you give them shield with something like Overflowing Barrier or Sanctuary, then the instant they get shield, they will lose their powerful and they will gain plated 3. Now, you'll notice I didn't say they will gain as much plated as they had powerful or vice versa. I said 3. And what this means is if you get arcane detonations on them, to remove their plated, or if you just like hit zeros on them to remove the plated, when they get back their shield again later, they'll still have the 3 plated again. They can also get temporary poisoned blood, which while they have 3 poisoned blood, so poisoned blood now is you will get 1, whenever they will lose health, you will get 1 poison for each rank of poisoned blood they have. It is worth noting this is only if you hit their health. Poisoned blood doesn't do anything if you hit their shield. But it does mean that you can find yourself in this awkward position where, you finally got rid of their shield, you have all your damage lined up, but now they have poison blood, and you don't really want to attack them, but they're setting up shields, so next turn they're going to get their plated 3 back. Sliges are pretty easily the hardest of the mid-bosses right now, I would say. They show up early enough that you're unlikely to be able to really effectively manage the poison they apply. If you're playing they have enough health, and especially with the plated, that it is difficult to aggro them out. So like they tend to be, in particular, a stonewall for aggro decks. I would avoid them if you are playing an aggressive deck because they just have, the cards they drop aren't going to be useful to an aggressive deck, and they are overall just going to be a pain in the butt to kill. But you should have seen them before they got 3 or 4 nerfs. The original version of them was absolutely way more brutal. It used to be 4 powerful and 4 plated. They used to have even more health and even more shield. They used to have permanent poison blood instead of permanent envenom, and they used to apply even more poison. The original version of Sliges pretty consistently applied an average of like 20 poison a turn. And that was without hitting their poison blood. It's not friendly. Moving on, their cards. Endless Oozing is gain 2 mana and poison 2, and then double both values. This is fine. It is, so Precarious Draw is gain 4 mana and poison 4, which is probably better most of the time, just because you immediately are getting 4 mana out of it. Like, gain 2 mana and poison 2 is very bad. The first time you play Endless Oozing, it is just incredibly underwhelming, because not only are you getting a downside, but you're not even getting a reasonable amount of mana out of it. Like, gain 2 mana, and that being the only text, is worse than almost every common mana card. So that's bad. This does obviously have a very high potential. If you play this a bunch of times, you're getting a lot of mana. But you'd never be able to deal with all the poison, which, if you are playing this multiple times, you're probably in a defensive deck. But it is still something to keep in mind. But I don't love it. I definitely wouldn't go out of my way to fight this. Like I said, Precarious Draught is going to be equivalent to Endless Oozing for the majority of decks most of the time. And Precarious Draught is going to be much stronger the first time you draw it. There's a huge difference between a mana card that gives you 4 mana and a mana card that gives you 2 mana. Although there's also a huge difference between one that gives you 4 mana and one that gives you 8 mana. You have to draw Endless Oozing 3 times before it will be 8 mana. And that's kind of a big ask. Especially since, like, the 4th time that you play it, if you don't have Purity to block the poison, you are going to have ways to manage that. Recycle Armor, though, is a lot better. Recycle Armor is 2 mana, lose 10 shield. If you do, draw 2, heal 10, and gain plated 1. If you're a defensive deck that has shield, this tends to be a fairly easy thing to do. It is relatively cheap. It draws you cards. It helps heal you, which can be an issue that defensive decks can sometimes have, where you have you can sometimes have rough early turns, or you may have to pay life for shrivels or whatever, and so you're normally not taking any damage. But if you do take health damage, you don't have ways to recover from that, and Recycle Armor will help patch up that blind spot. And then the fact that it does let you stack plated is pretty useful. It's fine. It does have the problem, of course, that similar to I forget the name of it, Kinetic Transfer, I believe. The strike we talked about earlier. If you don't have shield, it won't do anything. So obviously you want to take the card when you have shield. Also, it will help a lot if you can keep your initial max shield above 10. Because if you're starting fights with enough shield to play it, then obviously you're going to be more likely to be able to consistently use it. It also helps, it does provide you that plated one, which will do, between the plated and the healing, it will do a lot to help offset the potential defensive vulnerability that you're putting yourself in. It's very easy a lot of times to play Recycle Armor and then get enough out of it to more than make up for the 10 shield that you spent on it, which of course is something you want considering you're spending an epic card pick on it. Swarm Manipulator. So Swarm Manipulator summons two things, and the summons depend on the depth. And it's also worth noting that its pattern is it summons, it buffs, and then it does its second summon. So it on depth 1, I believe it just summons 2 Bintahs, so it's very easy to beat. On depth 2, it will summon a Bintah and then a Scyther Beetle. I think that's the order. I don't play depth 1 and depth 2 enough. On depth 3, it will summon a Canum and then a Scyther Beetle. Canums being, of course, desert worms, Scyther Beetles being, or maybe, no, it's the other way around. It summons a Scyther Beetle and then a Canum. Scyther Beetle is the beetles that can like apply bleed and can gain evasion. Canums are the big desert worms that can apply a bunch of debuffs and have permanent predator. The important thing to know about it is, unlike a lot of other summoners in this game, it will not resummon. Once it has summoned its 2 enemies for the fight, that's it. It also won't attack you while the summons are alive. It will just work on buffing them. It can give them shield, it can give them temporary plated, I believe it can give them powerful. But this tends to be a relatively easy fight. It is obviously harder than just Canum plus Scyther Beetle, but it's not too much harder. You will probably, and it does also have the benefit of, if you have a particularly aggressive deck, it only has like 100-ish health plus shield, so it is very possible to burn it down on turn 1 before it can summon. And even if you can't kill it on turn 1, because it takes it, it doesn't summon again until its third turn, you can usually kill it before it can summon the second enemy, and that will just mean that you only have to fight, a Scyther Beetle and the Swarm Manipulator on depth 3, instead of fighting all 3 of the things. So Swarm Manipulator, much easier than Slige's. Not totally trivial, but not too difficult either. It drops 2 cards. Extract Potential. Extract Potential is 2 mana, sacrifice an ally. If you do, gain Vengeance 6, heal 10, and draw 3. Okay, so I said that Voltaic Combustion was the worst card in the area. Extract Potential is close. Extract Potential at least has the benefit that you can theoretically kind of imagine a scenario where you want to play this, but kind of the problem that it has is, even if you have an ally to sacrifice, you have spent a card to summon that ally, and you spent a card to play Extract Potential. So when you draw 3, you're only going up 1 card total. And if you draw this before you summon, of course, it won't do anything. And then like Vengeance 6 is fine, but a lot of decks that have summons aren't doing that much actual damage on their own. The heal 10 is fine, but if you're a defensive deck, that like healing tends to be less valuable than shield as a proactive measure. So this is giving you entirely short-term value in effect, in exchange for giving up an ally that would usually help you longer term in a fight. It's not the worst ever technically, and I believe one day I said we are getting more ally summon, like 6 more types of ally summons in the next patch. So lots more toys to play with this, but right now Extract Potential is just usually bad. Swarm Calling is the card that would be best with Extract Potential, but you can't possibly get both in the same run. Swarm Calling is 2 mana, skill, summon 2 allied Bintah, trigger the action of all allies 1 time. And Bintahs do 3x2 damage and apply bleed 1 to the first enemy. So if there's only room for 1 ally, then this will be like 6. This will only be 6 damage to the first enemy plus apply bleed 1 to it, but that's fine. If you have any ways to take advantage of having summons, Swarm Calling tends to be pretty good. It tends to be very good with Spirit Swarm in particular, since Spirit Swarm really wants to be letting you stack powerful, and Swarm Calling will let you very quickly fill up the board so that you can start stacking more powerful. Swarm Calling Plus is 3 allied Bintah Pluses, which do 4x2 damage. They still only apply bleed 1. But Swarm Calling Plus will just always fill the board and then have all of the Bintahs attack. And it's worth noting, if you have other allies, this will trigger the action of all allies 1 time. So if you have spirits, this is a way to get extra damage out of your spirits. If you are playing, this is pretty bad with Paladin though, because spirits are fine trading off with Bintahs in terms of summon slots. Like once you have them out, once you're stacking powerful, like it's straight up the +1 damage per hit, and they both hit twice. So it's not a huge deal whether you're stacking the powerful on a Spirit or a Bintah. But for turrets, you obviously do not want to be taking up your precious turret summon slot, your dedicated ally slot, with a Bintah if you are counting on having a turret there. So it is worth noting, although they will apply bleed as part of their normal action, on the current patch, as of when I'm recording this, that bleed will fall off the instant the enemy starts their turn. So you will only get to use the bleed when you were triggering their action during your turn, because otherwise, like the Bintah will attack, it'll apply bleed. So you end your turn, Bintah takes its turn, it applies bleed to the enemy takes its turn, the instant it starts, it ends its turn, the bleed falls off. Once your turn starts, the bleed is already gone, and you won't be able to get value out of it. So that's a little unfortunate. But it's still a pretty usable card. It's not like amazing a lot of the time, but it's if you're not in a summon deck, it's not amazing, but it's pretty respectable. It in particular can be useful if you aren't sure what your plan is for Drakes, because this will just very easily clean off all the evasion that Drakes have. It's also pretty good at cleaning off Purity on enemies. And so that's all pretty nice. Warbot Annihilator. Warbot Annihilator only shows up at depth 3. It applies shock, it can gain powerful, it attacks. It's not actually that threatening though. It doesn't hit that hard, it doesn't have that much health or defense, and it doesn't really have any tricks as far as I can recall. I fought it a few times now, and I just have never really been threatened by it. I can't tell you exactly what it does, but I can tell you that what it does isn't very dangerous. I don't think I've ever died to it. I don't think I've ever been majorly threatened by it. I don't think I've even ever lost a substantial amount of health to it. I think it's weaker than most elites in the area. Like, defensive cannon is much better able to ruin your day than this is. Warbot Outrider also much more like, Warbot Raidleader is way more likely to ruin your day than Warbot Annihilator is. You fight Warbot Annihilator if you're just like, you just want to pick up the free win. You know, your choice is Slige or Warbot Annihilator, and that's no choice at all. Slige can make your day much worse. Warbot Annihilator won't. So, Rip Open is one of the two cards. It is deal 4x3 damage to the first enemy. If the enemy is bleeding, you give it vulnerable 2, and you deal 4x3 additional damage to it. One of the interesting quirks with how this is worded is that the vulnerable shows up midway through the attack, so the first 4x3 will not get the vulnerable benefit, the second 4x3 will. If you can consistently apply bleed, this is pretty good. This is 6 hits for a respectable amount of damage. And if you can't always apply bleeding, it's still okay, but it's just straight up slash, it's just 4x3 damage. So I would really only be happy about playing Rip Open if I am at least, let's say 50% of the time, able to hit a bleeding target. But if I can, it'll do good work. Versatile Strike is 3 mana for deal 3x2 damage to the first enemy. Give it bleed 1, and then you gain 8 shield and 1 non-temporary evasion. As the name suggests, this is a pretty versatile card. More aggressive decks will tend not to want it. But if you're kind of a mid-range deck, if you're playing, sort of like you're winning on turn 3 to 5 against most fights, this will do pretty good work. The shield and the evasion is nice. The applying bleed is okay, and it's some damage. It's fine. It's pretty much peak. I guess I'll play it. I don't think I've ever had a run where this card is like, yes, I needed this and it is saving me. But especially because that evasion is non-temporary, it can be pretty valuable in fights like Emerald Dragon, where you may potentially want to be able to have a bit of evasion sitting in your back pocket. Or Ruby Dragon is a better example, where with Ruby Dragon, if you can set up that evasion on turn 1 or 2 so that you have it ready to go for turn 3, you're pretty happy. So yeah, just reasonable. Warbot Annihilator. It's an enemy that drops some cards. That's your summary. Finally, the end bosses. Gargoyle Sentries. These were mid-bosses originally, and they used to be much nastier. They're always a trio. Same deal. We have, Arcane, Frost, Shock. They can gain Opportunist. Watch out for that. It's very easy to Opportunist, of course, means that whenever you get fatigue from drawing extra cards, they will immediately get an action, and it can be very easy to forget that they have that. And because it's, if you're used to fighting, if you're used to only having to deal with Opportunist from Prowlers and CPU, it can be easy to miss that, these guys have Opportunist, especially because, usually only one of them at a time will have Opportunist, so it's easy to miss, they all just attacked and gained some buffs. They can also gain the relevant status rune, although that's usually relatively non-threatening. They don't I think they have only like X2, maybe X3 attacks, and they don't attack every turn. They can give shield and tough to each other. They can give powerful to each other. They start with purity. They can be kind of annoying, but they're not a huge threat. They used to be, but they're not really anymore. They turn into a damaged gargoyle after death, and the damaged gargoyle will, of course, die into a broken gargoyle. Every time they die, they will lose all of their debuffs, but they will keep all of their buffs. So that's something to be wary of. Fortunately, once you kill one phase, the next phase won't act that turn, which is one of the reasons that they are not as threatening as they used to be. Originally, they would immediately get to act after a breaking, which means that you could like think, all right, I'll break this one, and then I'll be fine. And then the thing that came out would be doing enough arcane that you're just in trouble, and that was kind of nasty. But that's no longer a problem. So they are not too big of a deal. And then they drop pretty good cards. So Flawless Persistence is draw 1 strike and draw 1 skill, gain evasion 2 this turn, and plated 2 this turn, and discard 2. So the important note here is you draw before you discard, which means that if you play this as the last card in your hand, those 2 cards you draw are just getting discarded. However, what this also means is that if you are drawing strikes that do something on discard, then you will get bonus value. Let's say that you draw a pitiful strike or a defective strike, then you can discard it and immediately play it for free and get value. This is a pretty good defensive option because you get the evasion 2 and plated 2 this turn, which is going to be useful against a decent number of fights. Usually fights where the plated is weaker are fights where the evasion is more valuable, and vice versa. You do kind of want, this is, I would say, less powerful for most decks than the other 2 persistences, but it's not bad. The upgrade, it draws you 2 strikes and 2 skills and gives you 1 more plated this turn, and you discard 3, which means that you are break even on cards instead of being down a card. Because with Flawless Persistence, like you play it, so you had 1 card in your hand, and you play it, and you now have 0 cards in your hand after it's done resolving. And the upgraded version, you play it, you have 1 card in hand, and then if you play it as your last card in your hand, you'll actually end up a card because you get to keep 1 of the 4 cards you drew. And so that's nice. Perfected Strike is... so I say you end up upgrading. You end up at the same number of cards. You had 1 card in your hand before, you have 1 card in your hand after, so break even on cards technically, but that's still a whole lot better than going down a card, especially since you get to choose which of the 4 cards that you drew you want to keep. And if you have other cards in your hand, of course, you don't have to discard 3 of the ones you drew. Perfected Strike is lose 3 mana, deal 4x3 damage to the first enemy, gain powerful 2 this turn, and you play this card when drawn. Upgrades to only lose 2 mana, deal 5x3 damage, and gain powerful 3 this turn. I mentioned what the upgrade is because it's very relevant that you will lose less mana when it's upgraded. This card can be powerful and can also have a very real downside, which is that if it is the first card you draw on the turn, it can potentially eat up all your mana for the turn, and then you are sad. Especially if you don't have any mana cards to go with it. However, it is also a strike that is powerful when drawn that gives you additional powerful to go with your other strikes. So this goes great with Undying Persistence, with Flawless Persistence, or not Flawless Persistence, you can't get those 2 together. Enraged Persistence, that's the other one. It is kind of fun with, if you have Catan at level 10 and you draw Perfected Strike, you'll play it, and you'll create a copy, and then it'll play the copy, because level 10 will just create a copy of the first strike or spell you play, so that then you just immediately have all of that powerful this turn. And because of the weirdness of how this works, you even get to keep the copy that you generated, even though it was temporary and you've already played it, because you get to keep... It doesn't count for a card being used up if it's a temporary card until it leaves your hand. So that's fun. It is... Once you have it in your deck, you obviously do want to be aware of it when you are drawing, especially if you're drawing strikes, to make sure that you can... Because you get the effect even if you don't lose the mana. So if you, say, play Enraged Persistence using your last mana, and then you draw into this, you won't lose any mana because you don't have any mana to lose. So that's a thing to be careful of when playing around it. I would say that this is one of those cards that you are running in a specific deck that wants it. Both of these really are cards that you will know kind of that you want them when you take them. and that you won't take them if you aren't in the deck that wants them. But Perfected Strike is definitely not a weak card, and I think I have some runs that I've recorded that show off how good Perfected Strike can be, especially with Katon. Finally, we have Bintah Hell, my nemesis, Infested Goliath. Infested Goliath spawns Bintahs nearly every turn. It basically will only not spawn Bintahs every like 4th turn, or if there is no room to spawn a Bintah. And it can also provide shield and powerful to its allies. It will do a pretty devastating like X8 multi-attack if it has no space for summons. And when it hits 0 shield, it will summon 2 Bintahs, and it will add like 4 powerful to itself and all allies. And that's the first time it loses its shield each fight, which means that it is very difficult to get through the Infested Goliath fight without having to kill like at least 4 or 5 Bintahs. And I have at least one video where I had to kill like 16 Bintahs to get through the fight. That was I think it has been nerfed slightly since then, but wow. This fight, you can just find yourself in Bintah Hell. You really want to make sure that you have some way to deal to quickly kill things if this is coming up. Letting Bintahs sit around is not really an answer, because you will not last long against that devastating multi-attack. If that's what you're stuck looking at. You don't want to deal with that for multiple turns in a row. Its cards. Against the Swarm, give bleed 2 to any enemy per enemy alive. So if you play against the Swarm on an enemy and there are 3 enemies, then you give bleed 6. This is fine. It's pretty good in Shrew decks a lot of the times, because then you can like summon other enemies and then put all the bleed on, and then it will move around using the level 7, and that can add up to a lot of damage. It wasn't one of my runs, but it was one of the runs that Maleshtrottle was streaming, where he was able to get this with Spyglass and then was applying somewhere between like 18 to 24, because he upgraded it, 18 to 24 bleed to an enemy, and then would just play a bunch of other cards, and all the enemies would just die from bleeding out horribly very, very quickly. You do need to be able to play. You do need to be in a deck that is able to play a lot of cards. You do need to be. If you aren't summoning things, it becomes a lot worse, because against single bosses, obviously, if you're just getting 2 bleed out of this or 3 bleed out of this on upgrade, then it is pretty underwhelming. But if you are able to play a lot of cards, if you are able to take advantage of it, it can do a lot of work. Festering Wound is the other card. It is 2 mana. Give bleed 2 to the first enemy. Then give the enemy poison 3 per rank of bleed it has. So base case, this is bleed 2 and poison 6 for 2 mana, which is fine, I guess. Unlike against the Swarm, this is only to the first enemy. It upgrades to bleed 3 and poison 4, which is going to be 12 poison base. Even in a bleed heavy deck, I don't know how big a fan I am of this. Like, if you've gotten the enemy up to like 5 to 6 bleed, then shrug emoji. You're probably killing that enemy pretty quick anyway. Shrew's probably the only one who can really get value from this, and even then it's questionable. I don't think I'm a huge fan of Festering Wound. I'm willing to believe there is a deck where it can really show off, but I haven't played that deck yet, and I haven't seen that deck played yet, and so I don't know. I'm just not a huge believer right now, I think. I don't know that the bleed plus poison deck really exists as such. Like, Shrew can kind of put it together, but I would say that neither of these cards against the Storm, I think, has decks where it's going to shine. I don't think there's any real Shrew deck where you like see Festering Wound up against even like a handful of knives, and you look between the two of those and you're just like, I'll just take the handful of knives and I'll be a lot happier, I think, most of the time. So the last one, Robotic Mass. This one will only appear on depth 3. It does a lot of random stuff. Like, I asked one day, what is the theme of this thing? And apparently the answer is, it's going to do random things. You can't predict it. It's crazy. Anyway, it can do random status. It'll do like a random amount of a random status, and it'll do a random amount of damage. I think it made random how many times it's going to do the damage. Just it will tell you what it ended up deciding on once it shows you the intent. I think it applies a random amount of curse, and it gives a random amount of shrivels. I think it may even gain a random amount of frenzy. It does also have an action where it just does nothing. It does the same amount of nothing every time, though, which is 1 nothing. The big thing with it is there are a lot of times where you'll be fighting it and you'll just like be saying, please don't roll the 1 in 6 chance to freeze me and ruin my day. You know, you just get stuck taking that chance where you're just like, well, guess I hope it doesn't decide it hates me today. And if it does decide it hates you, there's nothing you can do. You are just sad. And that's unfortunate. That's just how this fight will go. But yeah. Has 2 cards, of course. Debris Strike is 3 mana. Deal 3 extra 3 damage to the first enemy. Apply 10 of a random status to it and give it Curse 2. I like Debris Strike a decent amount. 10 status is enough, of course, to trigger the first status proc on a normal enemy. Curse 2 is not that much curse, but it's okay. Debris Strike is one of those cards that I like, but I don't think it's actually great. You know, the fact that you don't have any control over what status it is. You know, if you're fighting, if you play it against a boss, there's a chance they'll just apply 10 frost and that won't do anything. Or, you know, it'll apply 10 shock and the enemy already has a bunch of shock on it. You don't care. The curse is so-so. You know, it is damage over time, but it's relatively low. Debris Strike is a funny card, but I don't know that it's a great card. Like I said, it's again another one of those cards where it's like you take it, you play it, it does some stuff. You're not sad, you're not super happy. You probably don't ever take it over. In quick play, you're probably more likely to take it because you won't have control of your card pool. But I think if you're playing like a constructed deck, most of the time you're just going to be like, yeah, it's okay, but this card I put in my deck specifically because it fits my deck's theme is better. I think that's going to be true the majority of the time. Turbulent Focus is the best card I'm not playing. It is gain 8 mana, deal 4 to 8 damage to all enemies. And that's 4 to 8 damage, so randomly somewhere between 4 to 8. And then you corrupt and dispel yourself 1 each. Corrupting yourself 1 isn't that big a downside, but dispelling yourself once absolutely is. If you have Purity, this will only cost you 1 Purity, which is nice. But if you don't have Purity, like this can potentially take away your Powerful, this could potentially be taking away your Plated, could be taking away the last rank of Tough that you have, etc. It is still theoretically very, very powerful though. Like 8 mana is a lot of mana, and the fact that you also get just like 6 AoE damage for free with your 8 mana, and this is from an Area 1 card, that's incredible. This card should be great. I keep not taking it and not playing it because I keep feeling like there have been a couple times where like I've been in a deck where I'm like, yes, I would take this card, and then it's either not offered or I just am not fighting Robotic Mass. But yeah, this card should be good, right? Like it's got to be good. I'm sure it is good if you have the right deck. I just have never hit this boss while I'm playing the right deck, so I don't end up taking it. But yeah, that is all of the monsters, all of the cards, and all of the things I have to say. That's it for this time. I believe I still owe you guys a guide to the new generic cards. I do also want to talk some about all of the, what was the other thing? All of the, not just the new generic cards, but cards that have changed enough to functionally be new. I just have been too lazy to go through and like collect a list of what cards qualify for that off of this patch. But that is it for this video. I will see you next time. Toodles.